day in court turned into something the whole nation couldn't ignore. Watch till the end to see why. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The red tally light blinked on above the camera lens of the National Court Network, signaling to the country that their broadcast was live. 12 million Americans tuned in from living rooms, bars, classrooms, and office break rooms to watch what had been billed as the most consequential trial in police brutality in a generation. The anchor, Rebecca Hayes, spoke with the clip precision of someone who knew history was unfolding on her watch. "This landmark case begins now," she announced, her voice echoing across the feed. Inside the grand marble hallways of the Chicago Federal Courthouse, polished stone reflected the glare of overhead lights. The crowd inside buzzed with anticipation as lawyers shuffled papers, reporters adjusted earpieces, and bailiffs tried to maintain order. On the far end of the hall, a tall black man in a dark suit walked steadily toward the courtroom doors, a leather briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. His expression was calm, but his presence radiated the weight of purpose. This man was Judge Michael Washington. Two uniformed officers, stationed at the entrance to restrict public access during the broadcast, stepped into his path. "Sir, this hallway is off-limits during live proceedings," Officer Karen O'Connor barked, her hand instinctively brushing the baton at her hip. Washington adjusted his tie with composed precision. His voice was even, almost judicial in its calmness. "Officer, I have every right to be here." Her partner, Officer Lisa Turner, crossed her arms and leaned forward with a smirk that carried both challenge and dismissal. "I don't care what you think your rights are. You're disrupting a federal proceeding. You need to leave." Michael's eyes flicked towards the camera mounted above the courtroom entrance. He knew it was live, that every word exchanged here would echo across millions of homes. He chose his words carefully. "Then perhaps you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." But there was no pause, no verification. O'Connor moved suddenly. Her hands shot out, gripping Michael's shoulders. In one swift motion, she shoved him against the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The collision was brutal, the crack of impact picked up by the sensitive microphone still streaming to the nation. Gasps rippled across households as viewers recoiled at the sound of the man's skull striking brass trim. Michael collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The back of his head struck with such force that blood immediately spread across the pale stone, forming a vivid pool that no viewer could ignore. The sight froze the courtroom staff nearby, but the cameras did not turn away. Every second was captured, broadcast, and shared. Michael groaned, disoriented, tasting blood in his mouth. His vision swam as he reached for the briefcase that had slipped from his hand in the fall. His fingers trembled as they brushed the handle. Behind him, the two officers stood over him with the casual arrogance of enforcers who believed they were beyond consequence. Bailiff James Brown burst through the courtroom doors, his eyes going wide at the sight of the man lying bloodied on the ground. "What the hell happened here?" His hand flew to his radio. "I need medics and federal backup right now." O'Connor's breathing was heavy from the shove, but her voice was rehearsed, almost mechanical. Suspect was interfering with proceedings. He became combative. Fell during the arrest. Turner echoed her partner with a shake of her head, arms crossed tightly as if she had already sealed her testimony. That's exactly what happened. But the lies were useless. The microphones had caught it all. The camera at the door had captured every movement. Millions of Americans had just seen what truly happened. An unarmed black man shoved violently by officers sworn to protect justice, bleeding on the courthouse floor. Attorney David Johnson, who had been preparing inside the courtroom, rushed into the hallway. His briefcase fell to the ground as he knelt beside Michael, recognition dawning in his sharp, legal mind. This wasn't just an assault. This was an unprecedented crime. A federal judge brutalized in his own courthouse. Michael's breathing grew ragged as he whispered hoarsely, "My briefcase?" Johnson leaned closer. "You need a doctor, not documents." "My briefcase," Michael repeated, his voice steadier now, eyes burning with urgency. Bailiff Brown spotted it several feet away, its papers scattered across the marble. He retrieved it quickly, setting it beside the injured man. "It's right here, sir." With shaking hands, Michael unclasped the leather and pulled out a folded black garment. The bystanders leaned in, confusion sweeping across their faces. As he struggled to his feet, supported by Johnson and Brown, he draped the garment over his shoulders. Gasps filled the hallway. It was a judge's robe. The recognition hit instantly. Court clerks covered their mouths in shock. Reporters pressed forward, already drafting the headlines in their minds. Security guards backed away, realizing with horror what had just occurred. O'Connor's face turned ghostly pale. Turner stumbled back, her composure fracturing under the weight of realization. Standing bloodied, his head wound dripping steadily onto the robe's black fabric, Michael Washington looked directly at the two officers. His voice, though strained by pain, resonated with undeniable authority. "I am Judge Michael Washington," he declared, his words carried live into millions of homes. "I am the presiding judge of this courthouse, and I was scheduled to begin the most important trial of my career, in this very room." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that hallway, every viewer across the country understood instantly. These officers had not just assaulted a man. They had assaulted the sitting federal judge who was about to preside over the trial of their fellow officers for the killing of his own father. For 12 million witnesses, the problem of police brutality had just been demonstrated in real time, not by distant footage or after-the-fact testimony, but in the very halls of justice, against the very figure who embodied it. And in that moment, as the cameras continued rolling and blood dripped onto the marble floor, the fate of American justice shifted forever. The marble hallway outside the courtroom was still streaked with the drying blood of Judge Michael Washington when he stepped through the heavy oak doors. His black robe, hastily thrown over his blood-stained shirt, hung unevenly across his shoulders. A fresh bandage pressed against his temple, but the wound beneath it was still seeping. His steps were unsteady, yet his presence commanded silence. Every person in that room, lawyers, clerks, jurors, reporters, rose to their feet instinctively, as if compelled by the gravity of what they were witnessing. "Be seated," Michael's voice rang out, firmer than the tremor in his hands suggested. The gavel cracked once, echoing across the chamber. Bailiff James Brown hovered close, eyes filled with worry. "Your Honor, with respect, you should still be with the medics. You need a hospital." Michael lifted a hand, silencing him. "The medical attention can wait. Justice cannot." His tone left no room for argument. Across the room, defense attorney Mark Richardson shifted in his seat, his face pale. He had spent months preparing for this trial, believing it would play out like so many others. Arguments buried in legalese, police testimony weighed against the voice of a grieving family, public attention eventually waning. Now, the case was being broadcast to 12 million Americans, and the presiding judge had just survived the same type of brutality that had killed his father. Richardson's carefully planned strategy had already collapsed. On the prosecution's side, David Johnson adjusted his tie and stood tall, his face set in grim determination. He had been fighting for 3 years to bring this case to trial, 3 years to uncover the truth about Robert Washington's death. But after what happened that morning, his case now carried the urgency of a national reckoning. Judge Washington looked directly at the jury, his gaze steady despite the bandage covering his wound. "Before we begin, I want to address what occurred this morning," he said. His words, broadcast live to millions, resonated with the clarity of a man who understood his place in history. "I was assaulted in this courthouse by 2 officers sworn to protect it. That assault was witnessed by all of you, indeed by the entire nation. Some might suggest that I recuse myself from these proceedings. I will not. The events of this morning only underscore why this trial must move forward without delay. Intimidation cannot silence justice." The jury nodded almost in unison, their expressions tense but resolute. "Mr. Johnson, you may proceed with your opening statement," the judge declared. David Johnson stepped forward, standing squarely in front of the jurors. He paused briefly, letting the weight of silence work for him. Then he began. 3 years ago, Robert Washington, a retired sergeant of the Chicago Police Department, was driving home from his grandson's birthday party. He had dedicated 25 years of his life to protecting this community. That night, he was pulled over for what officers claimed was a broken taillight. It wasn't broken. What followed was not law enforcement. It was execution. Johnson's voice rose with each word, his passion sharpened by the morning's events. Robert Washington complied with every command. He kept his hands on the wheel. He identified himself as a retired officer, and when asked to show identification, he announced his movements clearly. But when he reached for his wallet, which contained his retired police ID, Officers Sandra Murphy and Jennifer Wilson drew their weapons. Officer Wilson fired 3 shots. All 3 struck Robert Washington in the back. He died in a parking lot where he used to bring his grandchildren to feed ducks. A large monitor flickered to life beside him. On it appeared the body camera footage that had taken years to uncover, footage the department had buried, claiming malfunctions. The video showed Robert Washington sitting calmly in his sedan, his voice clear. "Good evening, officer," he said respectfully. Officer Murphy's voice responded, sharp and aggressive. "Your left taillight is out." "Officer, I just had my car inspected," Robert replied. His voice carried no defiance, only the tone of a man trying to clarify. Murphy leaned in. "Are you arguing with me?" From the other side of the car, Officer Wilson's voice entered. "We've got a resistant subject here, Sandra." On the video, Robert sighed lightly, still calm. "I'm not resisting. I'm reaching for my wallet, as you asked. My ID is right here." His hand moved slowly, deliberately, exactly as police are trained to instruct citizens. Then came the shots, 3 in rapid succession. Robert cried out, collapsing. The camera caught his final plea, faint but unmistakable. "Please don't shoot. I'm a retired police officer. I have grandchildren." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Several jurors visibly recoiled. One woman in the front row covered her mouth to stifle a sob. David Johnson faced them directly. "This is not policing. This is not protection. This is what happens when officers decide a black man's very presence is a threat, and it is why we are here today." He turned slightly, his gaze flicking toward Judge Washington, whose bandaged forehead glistened under the lights. "What you just saw on that screen is exactly what this nation witnessed this morning. 2 officers escalating a peaceful situation into violence because they believed they could. Robert Washington was killed for no reason other than the assumption that he was dangerous. This morning, his son, Judge Washington, was assaulted for the same reason. The courtroom was silent, every person holding their breath. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Johnson concluded, his voice steady now, "the evidence will show that Robert Washington did nothing to justify his death. The defendants lied in their reports. They covered up the footage, and they nearly escaped accountability. But today, justice will not be denied." He stepped back, his opening statement complete. Defense attorney Richardson stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his jacket. He turned to the jury, trying to summon his prepared remarks, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, policing is dangerous work. Officers must make split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. My clients, Officers Murphy and Wilson, followed their training when they believed their lives were in danger." Judge Washington leaned forward, his bandaged forehead catching the light. "Counselor," he interrupted, his tone measured but sharp, "are you suggesting that a man sitting with both hands visible on a steering wheel, calmly complying, posed a threat sufficient to justify deadly force?" Richardson hesitated. The cameras zoomed in, catching the beads of sweat forming at his temples. "Your Honor, the officers perceived perception," Michael interrupted again, his voice cutting like steel, "does not excuse execution. Continue." Richardson stammered, trying to regain footing. "You will see that my clients were faced with uncertainty, and uncertainty in policing can mean death. They acted according to their training." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Several exchanged skeptical glances. They had seen the footage. They had heard Robert's calm voice. The defense's argument was collapsing under the weight of reality. As Richardson retreated, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt different. It was no longer just a trial about two officers. It was about a system, a culture, a pattern of violence laid bare not only by body camera footage, but by what millions had witnessed live that very morning. Judge Washington steadied himself, gripping the edge of his bench. His head pounded with each heartbeat, but his eyes were sharp. The trial had begun, and there would be no turning back. "Mr. Johnson," he said firmly, "call your first witness." And with those words, the courtroom stepped fully into history. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the monitor at the front of the room went black. The jurors sat in tense silence, the sound of their own breathing suddenly loud in the hush. Judge Michael Washington, though pale and bandaged, leaned forward on the bench with an intensity that seemed to draw every eye toward him. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice clipped and steady, "you may call your first witness." David Johnson stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "The prosecution calls Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Cook County medical examiner." A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner approached the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. Her composure was calm, but every word she was about to say carried the weight of science that no excuse could twist. "Dr. Hernandez," Johnson began, "you performed the autopsy on Robert Washington?" "Yes, I did." "Please tell the jury what you found." Hernandez adjusted her glasses and glanced at the jurors. "The decedent, Robert Washington, sustained 3 gunshot wounds. All 3 entered from the back. The trajectory analysis showed he was standing upright, facing away from the shooters, with his hands raised above shoulder level at the time of the shots. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence of physical struggle." "And what does that mean, Doctor?" Johnson asked. "It means he was stationary, non-threatening, and compliant when he was shot," Hernandez replied firmly. "This was not consistent with the suspect lunging or attacking officers. This was an execution." The word hung in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, one biting back tears. Defense attorney Mark Richardson rose quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is making a legal conclusion. Judge Washington's gavel cracked once. Sustained in part. Dr. Hernandez, limit your testimony to medical findings. The medical examiner nodded. My findings are that Robert Washington was shot from behind while standing still with his arms raised. The bullet's paths make alternative scenarios impossible. Johnson nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Richardson approached for cross-examination, his voice less confident than usual. Doctor, is it possible the decedent was turning at the moment of the shots, making the trajectory appear as if he was still? No, Hernandez said flatly. The angle of entry and spacing of the wounds show he was not in motion. Turning would have altered the spread. It did not. Could adrenaline or stress have caused misperception by the officers? Richardson tried. That has nothing to do with the forensic evidence, Hernandez replied coldly. The science is clear. He was shot in the back while not moving forward. Richardson faltered. No further questions. As Hernandez stepped down, the tension in the room grew heavier. The jurors had heard it in simple, undeniable terms. Robert Washington was executed while complying. Johnson stood again. The prosecution calls Detective Lauren Price, Internal Affairs Division. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a plain gray suit, walked to the stand. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast as she raised her right hand and took the oath. She looked less like a defender of law and order and more like someone carrying the burden of complicity. Detective Price, Johnson began, you conducted the initial internal investigation into Robert Washington's death? Yes, she replied softly. What did Officers Sandra Murphy and Jennifer Wilson tell you happened that night? Price looked at her notes, though it was clear she remembered. They said Robert Washington refused to comply with repeated commands. They said he grew combative. They claimed he lunged toward Officer Murphy with what appeared to be a weapon. And what was your conclusion based on their statements? I ruled the shooting justified, Price admitted, her voice cracking. Johnson's tone sharpened. Detective, did you review the body camera footage before reaching that conclusion? Price hesitated, her silence filling the room like a confession. Finally, she whispered, No. The officers reported their cameras malfunctioned during the incident. I accepted their explanation. The jury shifted. The cameras from the National Court Network zoomed in on her face, broadcasting the tremor in her lips to millions. Detective, Johnson pressed, since then, you've seen the body camera footage recovered during federal review, correct? Yes. Does that footage support the officers' original reports? No. In fact, isn't it true, Johnson continued, stepping closer, that the footage shows Robert Washington was calm, compliant, and announced his every movement before reaching for his wallet? Price's eyes filled with tears. Yes, everything they told me was a lie. The words struck harder than any argument could. Even defense counsel flinched at her admission. Detective, Johnson said softly now, how many other cases have you encountered in which officers claimed body camera malfunctions during controversial incidents? Price looked down, hesitated, then forced herself to answer. At least 12 in the last 5 years, and how many of those officers were held accountable? Her voice broke. None. A gasp spread across the courtroom. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. On television screens across the country, viewers shook their heads in disbelief. Judge Washington leaned forward, his voice controlled but cold. Detective Price, are you telling this court that for 5 years your department allowed officers to escape accountability simply by claiming their cameras failed? Price nodded miserably. "Yes, Your Honor." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every juror stared at her as if weighing the cost of every life that might have been hidden behind the word malfunction. Johnson seized the moment. No further questions. Richardson rose for cross, his desperation clear. "Detective, could it be possible these malfunctions were genuine technical errors?" Price shook her head. "Not 12 times. Not always during the exact moment force was used." Richardson stammered. "But you can't prove—" Her voice hardened. "The officers lied. They concealed evidence. That's the truth." Richardson sat down, defeated. The prosecution wasn't finished. "The state calls Special Agent Marcus Williams, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Williams, a tall man with a calm, commanding presence, took the stand. His badge gleamed briefly as he swore in. "Agent Williams," Johnson began, "you led the federal review of this case?" "Yes. Once the family filed a civil rights lawsuit, we subpoenaed additional digital archives. That's how we recovered the body camera footage." "What was your reaction when you first saw it?" Williams's jaw tightened. "Outrage. In 20 years of investigating police misconduct, I've rarely seen such a clear case of unjustified deadly force." Robert Washington was calm. He identified himself as a retired officer. He announced every move. There was no weapon, and yet he was shot in the back. He glanced at the jury, his voice steady. "This wasn't fear. This wasn't training. This was bias and escalation, and it was followed by lies." "Agent Williams," Johnson said, his voice lowering, "in your expert opinion, could Robert Washington's death have been prevented?" "Absolutely," Williams answered without hesitation. "Every officer is trained in de-escalation and proportional response. These officers chose violence first. Robert Washington died because they saw a black man and assumed he was dangerous, despite all evidence to the contrary." Gasps rippled again. A juror wiped her eyes. Defense attorney Richardson stood for cross, his tone trembling. "Agent, is it possible the officers genuinely believed they were in danger?" Williams leaned forward. "Counselor, the footage shows a 68-year-old man, seated calmly, hands visible, verbally announcing his every move. He was shot in the back while standing with his hands raised. That's not danger. That's execution." Richardson froze, unable to respond. He sat slowly, shoulders slumped. The prosecution rested for the day, but the echoes of testimony lingered long after. The jurors' faces were pale, their expressions grim. In living rooms across America, families argued, cried, and nodded in agreement as the evidence cut through years of excuses. On the bench, Judge Washington gripped his gavel, his bloodied bandage catching the light once more. His father's voice, recorded on those cameras, still echoed in his ears. "Please don't shoot me. I have grandchildren." Justice was finally speaking, and this time the nation was listening. By late afternoon, sunlight had slipped to a thin gold blade across the upper windows of the Chicago Federal Courthouse. The jurors filed back into the box, faces grave, shoulders squared by the weight of what they had seen and heard. The hum of cameras from the National Court Network felt louder than before, as if the equipment itself understood what the nation was about to witness. Judge Michael Washington adjusted the fall of his black robe and steadied himself with both hands upon the bench. The bandage at his temple had turned a darker rose where the wound pressed against gauze, but his gaze was clear. "Members of the jury," he said, voice even, "have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson, Robert Martinez, stood. He was a retired public school teacher, a man who had spent 30 years convincing restless teenagers that words and evidence mattered. In his hands, he held the verdict forms as if they were thin, fragile bones. "We have, Your Honor." "Please hand the forms to the bailiff." Bailiff James Brown took the papers and passed them up. Judge Washington read them silently, then nodded once and returned them to Brown. "Mr. Martinez, you may publish the verdict." The courtroom exhaled and then held its breath again. In the case of the people of the state of Illinois versus Officer Sandra Murphy on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A soft cry escaped from somewhere in the gallery and was swallowed by the room. Murphy closed her eyes and tightened her jaw as though clenching against a storm that had finally made landfall. Martinez continued, steady and unflinching. In the case of the people versus Officer Jennifer Wilson on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. Wilson's hand slipped from her attorney's sleeve and fell into her lap. Defense counsel Mark Richardson stared at the table as if answers might be etched in the wood grain. They were not. The answers had already been shown in high definition and sworn under oath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Washington said, the gavel tapping once for order as murmurs rose and faded. "The court thanks you for your service. Sentencing will be scheduled following the preparation of presentence reports and the filing of any lawful motions. You are admonished not to discuss your deliberations until you have been released from service." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle. 12 million Americans were seeing something rare and simple: a jury rendering judgment according to evidence. Before anyone could stand, the judge spoke again. "This court is not yet adjourned. We have immediate business concerning a separate criminal matter that occurred this morning in this courthouse." Even those who had tried to brace for it were not prepared for how quickly the proceeding turned. Bailiff Brown stepped to the center aisle, voice ringing out with ritual clarity. "All rise for the defendants." Two figures entered in orange detention uniforms, their wrists cuffed in front. Officer Karen O'Connor and Officer Lisa Turner. Only hours earlier, they had stood in the same hallway as gatekeepers of order. Now they moved like sleepwalkers, eyes unfixed, the institutional fabric of their jumpsuits swallowing the last outlines of a badge they no longer wore. They faced the bench. Their lawyers flanked them, whispering with the frantic efficiency of people who had rehearsed every path and found only one open door. Judge Washington looked down at them, not triumphantly, not angrily, but with the cool, exacting attention of a man performing a necessary duty. "Officers O'Connor and Turner," he said, the titles still attached to their names by habit and record, though stripped of moral force, "you are charged by federal complaint with assault on a federal judge, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. You were advised of your rights earlier today and are represented by counsel. How do you plead?" O'Connor's attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, after consultation with counsel, Karen O'Connor pleads guilty to all counts." Turner's counsel stepped forward without prompting. "Your Honor, Lisa Turner pleads guilty to all counts." The sound was less than a whisper and more than a confession. It carried through the courtroom and all the way to the broadcast vans outside. Judge Washington nodded once, a gesture disciplined against any impulse to do more. The court accepts the defendant's pleas of guilty. The pleas are knowing, voluntary, and supported by a factual basis from the record and the publicly available broadcast. A tremor of recognition moved through the gallery. There would be no trial, no stretching of the moment into months of argument. The crimes had been plain, and the admission equally so. He inclined his head toward the defense tables where Murphy and Wilson sat subdued, their verdicts still cooling like ink. "Let the record reflect that the convictions rendered today are wholly independent of the incident this morning, and that this court has safeguarded the fairness of both matters. There is a difference between proximity and prejudice. We will honor that difference." He returned his attention to O'Connor and Turner. "Step forward." They did, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed somewhere near the floor. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This morning," he said, "you put your hands on a man whose identity you did not know. You were not verifying credentials. You were not de-escalating. You were not protecting anyone. You were enforcing a boundary that existed largely in your minds, deciding who belonged near the doors of justice and who did not." He let the words rest, not for effect, but so that they would land with the exact weight they deserved. "You slammed me into a door and left me bleeding on the floor of a courthouse," he continued, speaking with a steadiness that made the wound at his temple appear somehow more honest, not less. "But this is not a speech about me. Had I been a clerk, a juror, a witness, or a citizen, had I been anyone without a robe and a briefcase, the brutality would have been the same. The offense to the law would have been the same." A hush drifted across the pews. Even the cameras seemed to listen. "Justice," he said, "is not a security perimeter. Justice is not a hallway that narrows or widens according to who walks through it. Justice is a promise that does not ask you for a title before it applies. When you forgot that, you did not just fail your training, you denied the premise of your oath." He looked from one defendant to the other. "You have pleaded guilty. The court will set sentencing in the due course. Between now and then, I suggest you consider not what this has cost you, but what it has cost the public you were sworn to serve." He turned slightly, addressing the entire room, the cameras, the restless country beyond. "We tell our children that the law is bigger than any one person's anger, fear, or pride. This morning, that belief was tested. We do not answer such tests with rage or with retaliation or with spectacle. We answer them with process, with evidence, with verdicts, with the narrow, stubborn work of accountability." He let the gavel rest on the bench rather than strike it, a quiet refusal to reduce the moment to a single sound. "And because the public has watched this entire day, from blood on marble to verdicts read aloud, let me say this clearly: accountability is not hostility to policing. Accountability is the only loyal friend policing has left. If a badge is to mean anything, it must mean the same thing in every hallway, on every street, for every person." A single breath seemed to move through the gallery as one organism. Reporters scribbled. A juror pressed a tissue to her eyes. In the second row, a deputy who had served under Robert Washington years ago put a hand to his chest like he might steady something inside. Judge Washington returned to the strict architecture of the docket. Counsel will consult the clerk regarding dates for sentencing. Pre-trial detention orders for O'Connor and Turner are continued. Counsel for Murphy and Wilson may file any post-trial motions within the time allowed by rule. He nodded to the jury one last time. "You are excused with the court's gratitude. The marshal will escort you to the jury room." As the jurors filed out, the defendants were led away on diverging paths. 2 already convicted by verdict. 2 newly convicted by their own words. The courtroom did not cheer or jeer. It behaved like a place that understands winning and losing are not its true business. When the doors settled back into their frames, the judge spoke only to the record and, inevitably, to the nation. Court is in recess. The gavel struck once, not a flourish, but a period. It echoed in the chamber, then down the corridor, and then outward, carried by cameras and cables to a country that had spent months arguing about abstractions and had finally watched specifics. A stop, a lie, a video, a verdict, a shove, a plea, a reckoning. The sound of that single strike threaded through living rooms and phones and storefronts. It did not answer every question. It did something harder. It made the next one unavoidable. Morning broke over Chicago with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. Newsstands displayed bold headlines: "Justice for Robert Washington," "Historic Convictions Rock Police Culture," "Judge Assaulted," "Nation Watches Reckoning." Across television screens and social media feeds, millions relived the footage. The shots from the body cameras, the testimony that exposed systemic deceit, and the gavel strike that sealed the fate of 4 officers. Inside the courthouse, Judge Michael Washington sat alone in his chambers before the day's press conference. His robe hung neatly, but his bandage still pressed against the wound from the corridor. He stared at the framed photo of his father, Robert Washington, in uniform. For a moment, the stern face seemed to look back with a kind of quiet approval. When Michael stepped outside, the plaza was packed with reporters, cameras, and citizens who had gathered not to protest this time, but to witness what came next. Microphones crowded toward him, but he raised a hand, not to silence, but to steady. "Yesterday," he began, "this courthouse saw 2 things: the conviction of officers who murdered my father, and the guilty pleas of officers who assaulted me in its very halls. These verdicts are not vengeance, they are accountability, and accountability is the only thing that keeps the law alive." His words spread across networks, quoted within minutes by anchors nationwide. Congress reacted with speed rarely seen. Within a week, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Robert Washington Police Accountability Act. It mandated federal oversight of use-of-force incidents, required civilian review boards with binding authority, and created a national database to track officers found guilty of misconduct. Hearings in Washington, D.C., filled with testimony from experts and families, turned into a reckoning of decades-long excuses. Police chiefs from New York to Los Angeles stood before cameras, pledging reforms. The Chicago superintendent announced mandatory retraining and de-escalation, with continued employment dependent on passing exams. Departments began rewriting their policies: body cameras required at all times, failure to record treated as a disciplinary offense, and new training that emphasized guardianship over combat. The FBI launched a nationwide review of every case where malfunction had been cited. Within months, dozens of wrongful shootings were reopened. Officers who had hidden behind falsified reports faced indictments. Families who had long been ignored finally had their day in court. And the statistics began to shift. 6 months after the act's passage, use-of-force killings of unarmed civilians dropped sharply, 67% lower in cities that had implemented the new standards. Public trust, long eroded, began to creep upward in surveys. For the first time in decades, the badge started to regain the meaning it was supposed to have. Back in Chicago, the courthouse itself transformed. The marble corridor where Judge Washington had been slammed against the door now bore a bronze plaque. Here, on October 4th, 2025, justice was tested and did not look away. Above the main entrance, a new nameplate was unveiled: the Robert Washington Federal Courthouse. Families gathered in the plaza to watch the dedication ceremony. Michael's mother, Eleanora Washington, touched the name with trembling hands, tears sliding down her cheeks. The legacy extended beyond buildings. The Robert Washington Foundation was created with settlement funds and donations, offering legal aid to families of victims and grants to police departments committed to true reform. Its slogan, taken from Michael's own words, was engraved on every brochure: "Accountability is not the enemy of policing, it is its shield." In classrooms across the country, the story entered textbooks. Children learned about Robert Washington the same way they learned about the historic civil rights figures, a man whose death forced a nation to face itself. In police academies, recruits watch the footage not as a cautionary tale for civilians, but as a reminder of what betrayal of the badge looks like. Months later, at the first National Conference on Police Accountability, Judge Washington delivered the keynote address. He spoke not as a grieving son, but as a jurist who had seen the law's fragility and resilience. "My father served 25 years because he believed the law could be bigger than any one person's fear or prejudice," he said, his voice resonant in the packed auditorium. "He was right, if we are brave enough to let it be. Justice is not comfort. Justice is courage, and courage must be chosen again and again." The applause that followed was not just for him, but for a promise renewed. In the months and years to come, the name Washington, Robert, the retired sergeant who died with his hands raised, and Michael, the judge who carried his memory into history, became synonymous with a turning point. Not a perfect one, not a finished one, but a moment when the law remembered itself. And in the quiet of his chambers at the end of long days, Judge Washington would sometimes place his hand on that old photograph of his father, whispering words that the nation had come to understand. Justice chooses courage, not comfort. And for once, America had chosen well. This was more than a trial. It was a turning point. If you believe justice must never be silenced, type accountability in the comments, subscribe, and share this video to spread the message.